publicly shamed after being found alone and bloodied on the side of the road. Clara was dragged into the saloon like a disgrace. No one cared to hear her side of the story, and whispers about her shady past spread like wildfire. They hauled her in by the arms, her boots scraping across the dusty wooden floor. Blood streaked her temple, her dress torn and stained, but it wasn't the pain that made her eyes sting. It was the stares. The kind of looks people reserve for liars, harlots, or worse. No one reached out. No one asked if she was okay. The whole saloon was just watching, like she was a sideshow. Old Pete, the one-eyed bartender who'd served Clara coffee every Tuesday, like clockwork, didn't say a word. Neither did Martha Green, who used to knit on her porch and wave as Clara passed by. All of them were there, faces tight with judgment, whispering like snakes in dry grass. She probably had it coming. Someone muttered. Another scoffed, "She's always been a little off." Clara tried to speak. She really did. Her voice caught somewhere between her ribs and throat. The sheriff stood stone-faced near the bar, arms folded, waiting for her to confess to something. She didn't even understand. She could barely remember how she got there. The last thing she recalled was the headlights, the cold wind, and running. Then, just when the silence grew thick enough to suffocate, the saloon doors slammed open with a violent crack. A shadow stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, and marked by a long scar slicing down one cheek. His boots hit the floor heavy, like war drums, and his voice boomed across the room. "This woman is my wife." The air turned electric. Even the sheriff took a step back. And Clara? She had never seen this man in her life. The pain came before the memory. A sharp, pulsing throb behind Clara's right eye pulled her awake. She blinked against the harsh morning light, grit in her lashes and blood crusted near her temple. Gravel bit into her palms as she tried to push herself up, and her entire body screamed in protest. For a moment, she didn't even know where she was. Then the smell hit her, dry earth, motor oil, and something faintly metallic. She was lying just off the highway, somewhere between town and the ridge. Her dress was torn, one sandal missing. A trail of smudged footprints led back toward the road, and beyond that, tire tracks veered off into the ditch like someone had swerved hard. But there was no car in sight now. Clara's head spun. She clutched the side of her face, her fingers coming away red. Her heart raced, not from the injury but from the deep gnawing sense that this wasn't just an accident. This had been deliberate. The strange thing was, she remembered almost nothing, only flashes, running, breathing hard, someone yelling her name, then headlights. After that, it all went dark. A horn honked in the distance, and she flinched instinctively. Seconds later, a dusty pickup truck rolled to a stop nearby. It was Jimmy Halvers, the mechanic's teenage son, and when he stepped out and saw her, his mouth dropped open. "Jesus, Clara, what happened to you?" Clara tried to stand, her legs wobbling. I don't know," she said hoarsely. Jimmy hesitated for a beat too long. Then he reached for his phone. "I gotta call the sheriff." "No." The word shot out of her before she could stop it. Just help me home." But Jimmy was already dialing, eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or judgment. And that's when Clara felt it. This wasn't just about what had happened. This was about who they thought she was. The blood, the torn dress, the silence. It all fit a narrative the town had been itching to write. One they would cling to, no matter what she said. She knew it then. Whatever story was about to spread, it wasn't going to be hers. As the sheriff's car pulled up minutes later, Clara's pulse quickened. Not at the sight of the badge, but at the cold smile on his face. He didn't look surprised to see her like this. He looked satisfied. They didn't take her to the clinic. They didn't even take her to the station. The sheriff brought her straight to the saloon, as if her bruises were less important than the spectacle she'd become. The doors creaked open, and heads turned all at once. Afternoon sunlight filtered in behind her, casting a long shadow across the warped wooden floor. Clara felt like she was walking the plank. Her arms were bare, goosebumps rising where blood had dried, and every step made her limp more noticeable. The sheriff didn't hold her by the arm. He didn't need to. Shame did the job just fine. No one offered her a seat. Pete, behind the bar, wiped a glass that didn't need wiping. A couple of ranchers leaned back in their chairs, waiting to be entertained. And near the fireplace, Martha Green's lips curled. In that same tight smirk she wore at Sunday service, the one she used when talking about fallen women. Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat. "Found her out past Maple Ridge," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Alone. Bloodied up, dress torn. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses either. A slow murmur rolled through the room like a rising tide. Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to explain that she didn't remember, that something had happened. Something bad. But when she opened her mouth, her voice came out thin, brittle. "I was attacked," she whispered. Nobody flinched. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "By who?" I don't know." "Convenient," their eyes said. One of the ranchers spat into a tin bucket. "Sounds like another one of her stories." Another man chimed in. "She left town last year, didn't she? Ran off with some drifter?" "That's not true," Clara snapped, louder now. Her heart thudded in her chest. "I left to take care of my mother in Carson City." Martha sneered. "Oh, darling, we all know your mother's been dead for 3 years." A crack splintered in Clara's mind. The room blurred at the edges. Sheriff Hayes tilted his head. "You sure you want to keep lying, Clara? Folks here have got good memories. No one asked why she was bleeding. No one wondered who had left her out there. They were too busy rehearsing her guilt. Just as Clara's legs threatened to give out, the saloon doors thundered open again. A voice, deep, gravelly, unfamiliar, filled the room. "She's not alone. She's with me." And every soul in the saloon froze. No one moved. The man at the door stood tall, shoulders squared beneath a dusty black coat. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but the scar running down his cheek was unmistakable. It wasn't just a mark, it was a threat. And somehow, everyone in the room seemed to recognize it. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Clara stared, mouth slightly open. She didn't know this man. She was certain of it. Yet he looked at her like they'd shared a lifetime. "I'm Elijah," he said, his voice even, controlled. "And this woman is my wife." A collective gasp swept through the room. Pete dropped the glass he'd been pretending to polish. It shattered on the floor, but no one flinched. All eyes were on Clara, watching, calculating, her throat dried. "I don't know you," she said, her voice trembling. Elijah didn't blink. "You don't remember much, Clara, not after what you've been through." A perfectly timed sentence, ambiguous. It gave him just enough credibility to make people hesitate, and Clara enough doubt to keep quiet. Her heart pounded. What game was he playing? Sheriff Hayes narrowed his eyes. "You her husband, huh?" "That's right. You got proof?" Elijah pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Marriage license." Clara's name typed clean and sharp beside his. Her real name. A date that made no sense. Her blood ran cold. "That can't be real," she whispered. "I never married anyone." "You did. We eloped. You were scared, and rightly so." He looked around the room, his gaze hardening. This town's got a way of twisting things. Clara's knees nearly buckled. Elijah stepped closer, catching her by the elbow like a husband might. His grip was firm, but not cruel. She saw something in his eyes. Not affection, not comfort, but intention. He was here for a reason, and whatever it was, it had just turned the town upside down. As the sheriff reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Elijah to lead her out, Clara glanced back. The crowd no longer looked smug. They looked worried. Someone in that room knew exactly who Elijah was, and it scared the hell out of them. They barely made it past the church steps before Clara yanked her arm free. She spun around, planting her feet in the gravel. "Who the hell are you?" she hissed. Elijah didn't flinch. "I just saved you." By lying. By giving them something they understand. His tone was calm, maddeningly calm. They needed a story. I gave them one they were too scared to question. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. "You forged that license. I don't know you. And you are not my husband." He stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "No, but someone else was trying to be. Someone who nearly killed you last night." That stopped her cold. Elijah took a breath. "I wasn't lying when I said I was here to help you. But you were already in deep before I arrived." Clara's mind reeled. The crash, the darkness, the headlights, too close. "You know who did it?" He gave a slow nod. "I have a name, and a reason. But if I say it too soon, he'll vanish." "He's powerful, protected. You're not making sense." "I will," he promised. "But first, you have to play along. For now, I'm your husband. It's the only thing keeping you alive in that town." Clara looked down at her scraped hands, the ache in her ribs, the eyes that had watched her like a criminal, and she realized something chilling. Elijah might be a stranger, but he was the first person who'd treated her like she mattered. "I don't trust you," she said. "You shouldn't," he replied. That night, as Clara lay awake in the guest room of the old boarding house Elijah had claimed as theirs, she heard him whispering on the phone in the next room. Just before the call ended, she caught two words that made her blood run cold. "She doesn't remember." The next morning, Clara stepped into the diner, every nerve on edge. Eyes followed her again, but this time they didn't linger. A few people even looked away. Whatever aura Elijah carried, it had spread like smoke. No one quite knew what he was capable of, but they decided not to test him. She slid into a booth by the window, watching the dusty street outside. Elijah was late. She needed answers, not cryptic hints, not veiled warnings, real answers. He arrived 10 minutes later, carrying 2 coffees and a folded newspaper. His scar caught the morning light as he sat down across from her, casual as ever. "You sleep?" he asked. "I didn't dream," she replied flatly, "because I didn't sleep." Elijah sipped his coffee like he hadn't just turned her life into a bad western. "I get it. Trust is a hard sell." She leaned in. "Who are you really, and what do you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the newspaper and slid it across the table. A headline halfway down the page read, "Mysterious fire at Bishop Ranch leaves 1 dead." Clara frowned. "What does this have to do with—" "Elijah Bishop. That's who I am." He tapped the name. "That was my father's land." She blinked, stunned. "I disappeared for a reason," he continued. "After what happened to my family, after what he did, I couldn't stay." "Who?" "Elmer Langston." The name hit Clara like a blow to the chest. The man who'd tried to marry her. The one everyone called respectable. The one who smiled too wide and called her darling like it was a leash. "He's not who they think he is," Elijah said. "And he doesn't want you to remember what happened that night." Clara swallowed hard, flashes of memory stirring like dust. A party, a barn, his voice, her fear. Something buried deep. "What do you know?" she asked, voice trembling. "I know he tried to kill you, and I know we've got one shot to expose him." Elijah slid a photo across the table. Grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Elmer Langston, standing with the sheriff, laughing. The photo sat between them like a loaded gun. Clara stared at it, her chest tight. Sheriff Hayes, arm slung over Elmer Langston's shoulder like they were old war buddies. Maybe they were. In a town like this, alliances weren't formed in daylight. They were carved in secrets and sealed with silence. I thought the sheriff hated Elmer, Clara said quietly. Elijah shook his head. He hates anyone who threatens the order. Elmer funds half the town's projects, the church roof, the new school gym, even Hayes' re-election campaign. You think he's going to protect you from that? Clara felt sick. But the marriage? Certificate, she said. That wasn't real. So why pretend to be my husband? Because you were vulnerable, and because a husband can ask questions without raising eyebrows. A stranger can't. Not here. She rubbed her temple, as if the pressure might force the truth loose. Elmer, he was pushing to marry me. He'd talk like it was already decided. You were leverage, Elijah said bluntly. And maybe more. He needed to control someone who knew something. Clara's stomach turned. She thought back to the night she left town, how sudden it all was, how Elmer had shown up drunk at her doorstep, muttering things that didn't make sense. About loyalty, about knowing too much. She had packed and left the next morning, heart pounding the whole drive to Carson City. But she hadn't gone to Carson City. I didn't go to take care of my mother, she murmured. She died 3 years ago. Elijah's eyes sharpened. Where did you go? Clara's voice cracked. I don't know. A silence settled. Heavy. Sharp. You were missing for 8 weeks, Elijah said. Then you turned back up in town, wandering the edge of the highway, covered in blood. Clara clutched the edge of the table. What did he do to me? I don't know, Elijah replied. But I know someone who might. Elijah pulled out a second photo. This one older, creased at the edges. It showed a woman in scrubs, standing beside Clara. On the back, scribbled in faded ink, Ruth Bennett, Care Facility, Lyon County. The name Ruth Bennett stirred something in Clara's bones. Not a memory exactly, more like a feeling, a scent. A hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights. Someone humming off-key, her hand gripping a paper cup too tightly. They drove out of town that afternoon. The road stretched wide and empty, broken only by the occasional billboard for car insurance or a long-closed diner. Clara sat in silence, watching the landscape blur past, wondering how many lies had been layered into her own story. Lyon County's Care Facility sat on a slope near the edge of the desert, a squat building with peeling paint and tired trees out front. Inside, it smelled like lemon disinfectant and long-held grief. Ruth was older than the photo suggested, with wiry gray hair pinned up in a clip and eyes that studied Clara with unsettling calm. She didn't speak at first, just stared. Then, finally, in a voice brittle with age but clear as crystal, she said, "You made it out." Clara's throat tightened. "Do you remember me?" Ruth nodded. "You were brought in under a false name. Said you'd been in an accident. But the bruises told another story." Clara leaned forward. "Did I say what happened?" "No." Ruth shook her head slowly. "But you had night terrors, every night, screaming about fire and horses, and a man in a suit with a ring full of keys. Elmer. It had to be Elmer. He always jingled that damn key ring when he was nervous." "You stayed 3 weeks," Ruth continued. "Then one day, a man showed up. Said he was your brother. Had paperwork. Said he was taking you home." Clara's heart pounded. "I don't have a brother." "I know." Ruth looked down at her hands. But he was persuasive. And there were signatures. Elijah's face hardened beside her. "Do you remember what he looked like?" Ruth nodded. "Not a face I'll forget," She rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. In the back, she'd sketched a quick portrait. Rough, pencil-drawn, but unmistakable. It was the sheriff. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the notebook. For the first time, the fragments in her mind started to rearrange themselves. Not just a story about survival, but one of erasure. Someone had tried to make her disappear. By the time they got back to town, the air had changed. Not the weather, the mood. People didn't just glance at Clara now. They stared, some whispered. A few crossed the street altogether. Word had traveled. Elijah's presence, Clara's defiance, the past clawing its way up from under the floorboards. They didn't go back to the boarding house. Elijah had already guessed it wasn't safe. Instead, he led her to the abandoned mill outside town. It smelled of sawdust and memory, and the creak of the wind through broken windows was the only sound for miles. Clara paced the room, mind racing. Why the sheriff? Why would he go so far? Elijah leaned against a beam, arms crossed. Because he's been covering for Elmer for years. They built this town's quiet little empire together. Land deals, money laundering, blackmail. You were collateral damage. Clara's eyes burned. I didn't even know anything. You knew enough to say no. She froze. That was it. That was the first crack. The first resistance. The night Elmer asked her to marry him, and she didn't just decline. She laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, but with surprise. And that, for a man like Elmer, was unforgivable. Suddenly, the mill door groaned open. Footsteps, several, heavy. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Elmer Langston stepped into the shadows, flanked by two men, one holding a bat, the other what looked like a tire iron. The sheriff wasn't with him, but his absence was its own message. This wasn't official business. Elijah, Elmer said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Didn't expect to see you back in these parts. I go where the rot is, Elijah replied coolly. Elmer's eyes landed on Clara. And you should have stayed forgotten. Clara didn't move. You tried to erase me. You failed. Elmer chuckled, stepping onto the mill's raised platform, the same boards Elijah's father once used to cut timber. No, sweetheart, you erased yourself. You couldn't handle what you saw. That's why we sent you away. I remember now, she whispered. The barn, the fire. You locked the door. Because you were going to talk, he snapped. About the girl. About what you saw him do. Elijah tensed beside her. Clara turned to him slowly. You knew someone died. He nodded once. She was my sister. The truth had barely settled in before Elmer lunged forward, pulling a pistol from inside his coat. But Elijah was faster, and the sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty mill like thunder in a coffin. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes too late. By then, Elmer Langston lay unconscious on the mill floor, blood seeping into the sawdust beneath him. The two men who came with him had run, one limping, the other leaving behind his weapon. Elijah had taken the shot clean through Elmer's shoulder, enough to stop him, not to kill. But it was Clara's voice that had held him back from doing more. He needs to answer for it, she had said, her voice shaking but clear. The whole town needs to hear the truth. Now, the sheriff stood at the threshold, hand twitching. Near his holster, gaze locked on the man who'd helped bury more secrets than any one badge could cover. But there were too many witnesses now. Ruth had called the state police, and sirens were already howling down the ridge road. Hayes could only watch it crumble. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. By the next morning, the town was buzzing. And for once, it wasn't about Clara's shady past. The newspapers called it the Bishop Mill incident. Details were murky at first, but as Ruth came forward and Elijah handed over files his father had kept hidden for years, the real story began to bleed through. embezzlement, assault, the disappearance of 2 girls, including Elijah's sister. Elmer Langston was the match. The sheriff had been the gasoline. And Clara? She testified. In the courtroom weeks later, she stood tall, in a clean dress, hair tied back, her scars still visible but worn like medals. The whispers were different now, hushed, regretful. The town didn't apologize. Towns like this rarely do. But they listened. They watched. And for the first time in a long time, they left her alone. As for Elijah, he disappeared as quietly as he'd come. No goodbyes. Just a folded note on her porch one morning. You never owed them your silence. I only helped you remember that. Clara kept that note in her drawer, next to the newspaper clippings. Not because she needed proof, but because it reminded her that sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes it looks like a scarred stranger walking through a saloon door and refusing to let you stand alone.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?